Hello YouTube, and welcome back to The Educated Barbarian. I apologize for the long hiatus. I understand that you guys were waiting for the next issue and didn't see it coming and it was confusing. The reason why I had to take so long to actually come back with these videos is because I realized that I wasn't going about it the correct way. It felt like I was doing something wrong because the videos were long, but by rewatching them, I realized that they were too confusing while also being dense at the same time, and I didn't get to the point. And the problem is that this type of stream of consciousness feeded Stoicism and Bushido because the texts were easier to understand. But now we're going to deal with Nietzsche, with Jung. It's just not possible for me to continue the way I used to do it. So, for these books that I announced previously, I'm going to change the formula. Instead of reading from the book and going line by line and explaining to you what happens, I rather want to create a summary chapter by chapter of the most important themes, because that way I can condense all of the information, I can order it by importance and pertinence and create groups that actually go well together instead of going back and forth between concepts. And it's going to allow you to actually understand what's going on. The videos are going to be shorter, but they're also going to be more dense in information. It's not going to be as diffused. So I hope that you actually enjoy this new format of The Educated Barbarian. Let me know what you think. For this series on Nietzsche, for the book Beyond Good and Evil, I have prepared 9 episodes for you. And it's the reason why it took me so long to come back. You will get one every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. And after these 9 episodes, we'll move to Jung, and I will keep the same format going. Because as you will see, it's going to make it so much easier for me to share the philosophies of these men with you. We're going to be able to cut to the chase and get to the bone, to the heart of the problem, so that you understand it, you make it your own, and it becomes something that makes your life better. It gives you a stronger ability to think and to approach philosophy as a whole. So, let us get started. What is le propos de Nietzsche? What is his big idea? And what is the big idea of philosophy in general? Well, in Beyond Good and Evil, chapter 1 opens by telling us that philosophers everywhere always were seeking the truth. The goal of it all was what Nietzsche calls the will to truth, which was always at the core of any intellectual endeavor. Therefore, it served both as a source and objective, which is interesting because this means that it was bicephalic in a sense, but it also created problems, because how exactly can the truth both be the source of the information that you're going to propose and its objective? It sort of throws the truth back to a state of impossibility where to seek the truth, you need to actually access the truth. And that is a problem, because this means that this quest for the truth was faulty at the start. Most likely because we never truly understood what it was. And that is Nietzsche's biggest and first objective. Explaining what the truth is in the first place, because it seems as if we have been seeking for something that we don't quite understand. We have been writing books about philosophy for hundreds, thousands of years, and yet we always go back to the beginning. We do not have a definitive understanding of what the truth is, and as the author stated beautifully, it seems as if it were hardly commenced. This should tell us that there is something suspicious in this so-called truth. Could it be maybe that this concept is an invention that humans came up with that has no actual existence in reality? That is a possibility that we have to entertain, because there's really only 2 choices. Either the truth doesn't exist, or we humans don't know how to look for it, and that's also a possibility. We might have been able to actually define the truth, give a name to a concept or principle, and understand in spirit what it should be, but it still leaves us incapable of actually accessing it, which is why, again, to go back to the paradigm of the source and the objective, we have an objective, we want the truth, but we are incapable of telling where it comes from, and therefore we can never actually pinpoint and locate it in our environmental matrix, and therefore we are at a loss. And yet, it seems to be, again, that the core of any philosophy, of any books in general, and intellectual endeavor was this will to truth. So we are drawn towards something that we cannot quite grasp or understand. Just like a dog chasing a car. What makes the car so attractive to the dog? Could it be maybe that it's because he cannot catch it? If the car actually stops, if you want to try in your life, everyday life, you will see that the dog doesn't know what to do with the car. What would humans do with the truth? Most likely, nothing, because we are not equipped to actually handle it. The truth is in the realm of godhood. It's something that we meekly humans cannot actually handle. But it's not a problem because there's a chance that we'll never actually get to grasp it. And Nietzsche also asks a very interesting question. Why do we have this will to truth, even though we cannot get it, rather than looking for untruth? Because untruth, we know where it is. Just by opening your mouth, you can produce untruth, you can produce lies. And it's very easy also to see the source of lies and the objective of a lie. The opposite of truth, untruth, or falsehood, is much more transparent in a sense and much easier to grasp. Because the nature of humanity is much closer to lying than to actually telling the truth. We are much more prone to doing the former rather than actually opening ourselves to a concept again that we cannot quite grasp. And my understanding and my conclusion when it comes to that point, it is that because truth is seen as valuable, something that we call le vrai in French, we gravitate towards it naturally because we understand that as a concept, it is something worth pursuing because once you figure out the truth, you should have a much higher chance of survival. But at the same time, untruth, the opposite of it, that we have an easier time to actually access, is seen as dangerous. It's what we call le faux. So it's also why, even though we are more aligned and we have more familiarity with the concept of untruth, we reject it. No one will gladly admit to you that they're a liar. Why? Because it's negatively connotated within the species, and therefore we reject it with everything we have. But the question therefore is it really a good method? And is it maybe the reason why we cannot grasp the truth? Is it maybe that our distrust of untruth, that is in reality deeply hypocritical, is the reason why we cannot grab the opposite of it? Maybe, just maybe, both truth and untruth come from the same source, and if you refuse to actually admit and accept and espouse one, then the other one will remain impossible to reach forever. Now, philosophers believe untruth to be worthless, and that's what I just described, because the truth itself cannot originate from its opposite. That is something that you will hear a lot in philosophy, where if you try to think about concepts by starting from their opposite or from something that is considered to be a negative pendant of a positive concept, people will tell you that it's not a good way to resonate, that you cannot go from bad to good because we have created this separation between the two concepts. We do not want the two to mix. We don't want the purity of the truth to ever touch the darkness and the soiled nature of the untruth. And that is purely subjective, and it's a purely human notion. Not only do we most likely have engineered a concept of truth, but we then tainted it with our own understanding of what it would be like. We suppose truth to be pure, and because it's supposed to be pure, it is also supposed to be original. And there is actually, of course, a very deeply rooted religious background to this entire subtext, meaning that it's the same way we think about godhood. When we think about God, God can only be pure. But we cannot just understand the word in terms of things that are good. We always need evil. We understand that it's a natural pendant of the first concept of, again, truth. So what do? Well, we create a separate entity that is seen as completely removed from the original, aka God and the devil, the truth and untruth. Have you ever thought to yourself, maybe it's a little bit strange that we call the devil, Iblis, the father of lies? There is a reason for that. He is the negative pendant. But if you think about where he came from, he used to be an angel. So he came from truth. Il n'y a qu'un pas between this and accepting that maybe, just maybe, our understanding of original goodness and removed evil might be flipped on its head. Maybe evil is what gave birth to goodness. Maybe the fruit of knowledge is what allowed humans to access the possibility of actually doing good deeds. That's a discussion we're going to have later on in other chapters because religion is an important part of this book. But because we have, again, created this completely arbitrary distinction, we are forcing untruth to become a derivate of truth, and we ascribe an arbitrary hereditary nature to the very concept. So we see it as like an ancestry tree. We look at it as if, again, one descended from the other. So we, by default, put truth above lies, above untruth. Direct quote from Nietzsche. Things of the highest value must have an origin of their own. By saying that, he is quoting the type of people that I just described, who think that anything that we humans decide have value must come from itself. It must have the ability to self-originate, which is also the reason why God is said to have created himself, because no one created God. This is also the same reason why. In a sense, it's a deification of the truth. But the problem with this approach, with this Abrahamic approach of the concept of truth in terms of philosophical description, is that it leads us to the inability to pinpoint its origin. We cannot guess the source because we keep repeating that it has no source. Truth is its own source. So we have created a situation where it's impossible to actually access it. And because locating its position is now impossible, we cannot understand its creation. That, of course, is also logical, just like we cannot understand the creation of God, because we have created the concept of God as a self-originating entity, which has cut the possibility of us actually understanding what we created or what created us. Regardless of the position you take, it's still the same problem. Approaching this discussion through the scope of value exposes philosophers to an emotional bias that paradoxically disallows them to recognize the truth as a concept born from human emotions. Most likely, if you are a Christian or Muslim or religious, what I just said didn't sit right with you because you have accepted the idea of God as, again, a self-creating entity. I'm not trying to tell you that God doesn't exist, and actually it's not Nietzsche's point either. What he's saying rather is that our understanding of the deity makes it so that we cannot understand it. Les voies du Seigneur sont impénétrables, we cannot understand God's ways, not because they are impossible to understand, but because the way we look at them makes it impossible. The way we perceive them makes it impossible. And so, this idea of giving a value to truth and a value to lies is a mistake to start with. If you are to do it, you need to be able to express why in factual terms and not in terms of emotions. You cannot just say, well, because it is right or because it is not right. That, again, are just judgments of values, and in philosophy, they have never led to anything interesting. In spite of all the value which may belong to the true, it might be possible for emotions or concepts we generally consider negative to hold an even greater value. That is the natural continuation of the idea and the philosophy I just presented. If we are to not immediately ascribe arbitrary values to concepts, this also means that the so-called negative concepts need to be taken and observed for what they are, which is something that could potentially be valuable. And that is also, again, in spite of all the value which may belong to the true. Nietzsche at no point says that there is no such thing as the truth, and he's not saying, and that's the most important part, that the truth is worse than lies. No, he accepts the truth as a concept that needs to remain sacred, but the observation of the concept needs to be revamped, because if we are to hold it to such a high standard, and it's going to occupy such an important part in our lives because we chase after the truth, we need to know what we're chasing, or else it's all for nothing. We're just wasting our times. Love is a good example of one of these emotions that might be more complicated than people think at first glance. I say that because negative emotions like hatred or jealousy can still be utilized to access a greater understanding of the truth, because you can look at their origin. It's what I said previously. It's much easier to know where negative emotions come from. Hatred because someone stole something from your house. Jealousy because someone has something that you don't have. These you can explain. But something like love, for example, how do you explain love? Well, many people would tell you that love cannot be explained. You just love people. Nietzsche tells you that it's because we look at love in such a pure fashion that we cannot understand it. Love could be explained biologically. It could be explained by financial measures. It could be explained by purely aesthetic attributes. You love someone because they're pretty. That is a factor of love. But because, again, we have romanticized love and we have put it, again, on the pedestal, we don't grasp it. We cannot approach it, and therefore we're not intelligent when we think about it. Which also means that love could also contain negative emotions that could give birth to its existence, but that we ignore because we do not want to think of it as something even remotely negative. Just like, again, God or the truth are seen as purely positive, but nothing is purely positive. Which also means that the concept of the truth that we came up with is most likely a farce. There's no such thing as the truth. There are portions of truth, there are percentages of things that are correct, but nothing is 100% correct. Or if it is, we don't know how to access it. We're not there yet. And therefore we need to keep working, because many people think that they have grasped something that is called the truth, and therefore they stop striving to actually grasp its actual entity. What constitutes the value of those good things consists in them being insidiously related to these evil and apparently opposed things, perhaps even in being identical with them. That is the summary and the conclusion for this paragraph and this idea in general. Maybe, all of the things that we deem as good, that we deem as valuable, the truth itself, all of these stem, and that value stems from all of their negative pendants that we refuse to see. It's something I just explained with the concept of love that is more complex than most people think. And Nietzsche even goes further and says that it might even be that they're identical, meaning that the truth and untruth are the same thing. What distinguishes them is our subjectivity in the instant. Within love are positive and negative concepts. Maybe there's no such thing. Maybe they are just concepts, and your subjectivity tells you that some of them are good, some of them are bad. Again, it's all hypothetical. Nietzsche is not engaging in moral relativism. He's just trying to, again, approach a concept that has been accepted as correct for too long and revamp it and shake things up. This has an aim, and that aim is to distinguish between truth and untruth for practical reasons only. There is always an underlying pragmatical reason for everything Nietzsche does. Sometimes it's tough to get to it, but it's always there. You need to always keep looking for it, because this is exactly what the goal is here. Why do we want to distinguish between truth and untruth? Well, for one simple reason. We assign and we ascribe a more positive value to the truth. But why? Well, because it tends to be something that, once it's mastered, allows you to move forth and forward. For example, you have figured out that this type of water is safe to drink. That is truth. That truth allows you then to consume the water and survive. Untruth would be knowing that the water is poisonous. That is great, now you know it, but it doesn't solve your problem. And it's also something that is temporary, because you will move to the next source of water and now you have to repeat the process. Truth is accepted as something permanent, and permanence creates stability, and stability creates the survival of the species. But to be able to actually fulfill that survival, we need to approach things from a practical standpoint only, and push away the romantic values and the romantic scope that we look at things through. It's heartbreaking and it's anti-literature in a sense to approach things like this, but in terms of practical philosophy, it's the only way to do it, because if not, you're going to be sucked in all of these meanderings and all of these mièvreries, as we say in French, which lead nowhere. Our own mode of thinking, that we believe to be purely driven by reason, is therefore closely related to instinct, which, in order to fulfill physiological demands, maintains a definite mode of life. If we are to approach truth and untruth, it is through our psyche, spirit, intellect, whatever you want to call it. That is what is known as a mode of thinking. But that mode of thinking fails us constantly because, as I have proven, the way we think about truth is not the proper way. So what do? Well, we need to go back to instinct. Instinct, which in reality is the purest form of reason. The other form of reason tends to just be delusion. And most of the time, a correct philosophical concept, something as close to the truth as possible, is instinctive, meaning that it's something that you know instinctively, and then you come up with philosophical arguments and things to defend it. But the way you find it tends to not be scientific in approach. It tends to be in your bones, per se. And that instinct is incredibly important and makes sense because it's aligned with physiological demands, and that definite mode of life that we maintain is survival. It's why we always look after the truth. It's because it's correlated with survival. And falsehood is correlated with death. It's why these things are positive or negative. Now we explained why. Pragmatically speaking, I just told you why you seek for truth. And it makes it easier to grasp because now you finally understand the objective, and now you can also find the source. We need things to be certain, making truth a valuable commodity, just like water or food. Outside of that mode of thinking I just described, that resonates via instinct, the falseness of an opinion should only be an issue if it isn't life-furthering. So that also is, in a way, a method to not obsess too much over the truth about the truth. If you are faced with untruth, why does it pose a problem? What is the problem with someone who lies? Well, it's only a problem if it isn't life-furthering. If the lie creates a problem in your life because now it's going to damage your ability to survive, or if someone lies to themselves and it's going to make it tougher for them to see tomorrow. These are the problems that arise. Meaning that it's only if it has no practical applications. That means that if a false opinion has something to do with the ability to reach the truth or a revelation of sorts, it has a place. This shows that we do not want to banish lies, we do not want to banish untruth, because it is a necessary condition for our quest to actually access the truth. Most likely also, if we remove untruth from this word, truth would be removed as well, and something I described already. Because we refuse to accept untruth, we also cannot access the truth. This pragmatical approach to truth dictates that man couldn't live without falsehood, because it's what allows him to access the truth. Quote, the renunciation of false opinions would be a renunciation of life, and that is absolutely correct. Always think about things this way when you think about concepts. Stop separating concepts between good and evil in your head, because most likely, if your plan came to fruition and that separation was effective, the entire concept would vanish. You need to accept it as a whole and then objectively look at the concept and its portions and parcels and take what is life-furthering, what helps survival, and what doesn't. Don't get rid of the stuff that doesn't, but understand in your head that it stays this way. The two will remain connected whatever you do. And this is also a throwback to the hierarchy that we created between good and evil, because now, if you think about it, you will not allow yourself anymore to think of good here and evil here. To go back to theology, isn't it interesting that God is described as being in heaven and the devil is described as being on earth, underneath the ground? There is a gradation happening here. One is above, atop the other. Nietzsche wants you to think about these two things as parallels, meaning that they are both at the same level. They are balanced. And by placing good, which we can call truth here, and evil, untruth, again, arbitrary, on an equal footing, we're not negating these values. Not at all. It's not, the goal is not to say that they don't exist or that their nature is not positive or negative, but rather we want to question what constitutes virtue in the first place. Why would truth be good? That is the question we must ask ourselves. To understand how each got their rank is to accept and understand our own subjectivity. Because if you just listen to what I say, you will understand and accept that truth was called truth because we have decided that it's good. So the idea that it originated itself is a lie, paradoxically. The truth didn't appear and then we started calling things that are good the truth. We started seeing good things and we called them the truth, meaning that the existence of the truth precedes and predates the very name. So the semantics came after the existence. And that is also true for other concepts that I'm not going to cover here, but you grasp where I'm coming from here. So that subjectivity is very important to grasp because it's the way we actually interact with the world. And the issue is that philosophers often refuse to do that. They refuse to accept their own subjectivity, leading to truth being presented as an objective concept when it cannot be. Again, we created truth. It's a human concept and every human concept is subjective by nature. However, since its very achievement, the achievement of truth, can only be attained through personal ideas and biases, refusing to accept its discovery as being thanks to subjectivity often leads to an inability to access truth altogether, as I have already described. It's an important thing to keep in mind because you will meet people in your life who will tell you that what you just said is just your opinion or your bias. To these people, I want you to look at them in the eye and say, yes, because I'm a human. This is how we navigate the world. Everything that comes out of your mouth is biased. It's subjective in one way or another. And again, it's insane because Nietzsche perfectly diagnosed the obsession that people have with objectivity because objectivity in these people's heads equals the truth. But the truth is not reachable by humans. So when someone pretends to be objective, when they actually mean that what they say is the truth and only the truth, they are actually deceiving you and themselves because they are lying. By telling the truth, by thinking they are telling the truth, they are lying to you. Quote, "They are all advocates who refuse to be regarded as such," to describe human. Every single human wants the ability to tap into the truth. We want to be direct messengers of God, of nature, but we lack that ability altogether. And when someone, like I'm doing right now, points this out, people get upset because we're all advocating for something. Our subjectivity always plays a role, but if we were to accept it, it would also take away from its value because people would then regard what you say as questionable. Whereas if you can claim to possess the truth, one does not question the truth. One does not question God. This entire masquerade, as Nietzsche very accurately points out, is a sign of vulnerability because it's a refusal to see your points being challenged. You refuse to open up discussion, which is anti-human and anti-philosophical, anti-scientific, etc., etc. It's a sign of weakness, of semantical, of rhetorical weakness. The greatest philosophies are those that accept their subjective nature and recognize that the true goal of their existence isn't the will to knowledge or the will to truth, these being simple instruments used to achieve a far greater goal, the will to power. I want you to keep these words in mind, the will to power, because it's at the center of Nietzsche's philosophy. His idea is that every single book, every single action done by a human, from the start of existence until now, was always driven by a will to power. The will to truth was always a lie. The will to truth is an instrument. We want to seek truth, not for truth's sake, but for power. When you discuss with someone and you have the truth on your side, aka you're correct, the word aligns with your view, your objective, what does it do? It gives you the upper hand. You win. That is power. It has nothing to do with the truth. And philosophy has always done that, which makes philosophy much cooler in my opinion, because we go from people who are looking for the truth to men who are in a quest to obtain as much power as possible. And that is what humans have always done. We always strive to get more power. Nietzsche actually uses the Stoics to explain that. And it might sound counterindicated considering that I made several videos about the Stoics, but understand that just because I align with Stoicism doesn't mean that I don't recognize the thoughts in the philosophy. So the reason why he uses them as an example is because the Stoics, if you have followed the series, want to live according to nature. But it's impossible for beings like men whose strength resides in their subjectivity, is what I said previously. Men cannot access the truth because they are men. If we could access the truth, we wouldn't be men. It's the reason why we created God. God, aka the truth, is the only holder of that very concept. It's the same in that case. How could we live according to nature? We are from nature, it's our source, of course, but we are not nature. We are not a simple copy of nature, because if we were, we would just be called nature, not men. And that subjectivity and the refusal to accept it, as I said, is a weakness, because the strength of human beings resides in our subjectivity. The very understanding of the people who think in such fashion is that what nature constitutes is, again, something that must align with us. It's something that you will understand when you read Stoics. You will come to realize that in truth, it's not that we align with nature according to Stoicism, but rather that Stoic authors would want nature to align with them. Just like, again, we pretend that we want to align with the truth, but in reality what we do is we force the truth to align with us. And that means that this very understanding of nature to start with is tainted. Does that ring a bell? Yes, it's the same as with truth. Truth is inaccessible because we don't understand what it is in the first place. It might not even exist. Same for nature. We wouldn't be able to grasp what nature is because it's too complicated a concept. So the only moment where we can actually give it a definition is going to be through our subjectivity, so it's going to be a human definition, and it's going to take a part of us with it. If you think back again to religion, God created us after his image. Or maybe we created God after our image. I know it's total blasphemy to say it. Understand it's within the philosophical realm. I'm not saying that God doesn't exist again. I'm just saying that with all of these concepts, God, truth, nature, it always seems that we pretend that we come from them, but when you dig a bit, you end up finding out that it's not really the truth. It's not really accurate, rather. It's the opposite. These things originated from us, from our subjectivity. And so we make everything after our own image, and we pretend that in a weird semantical switcheroo that it didn't happen like this, that we are the chicken and the egg had nothing to do with us. But if you observe what I just described, it seems highly impossible. If we were ever able to live according to nature, to continue with the example, we wouldn't even have to think about it, because we would just know. It's the same with the truth. Why do we have to think about the truth? Because we are not truthful creatures. If we were, the truth would come naturally to us. What comes naturally to us? Lies, subjectivity, because that's the type of creature that we are. But to Nietzsche's point and to the Stoics' point, in a sense, they are correct. We do live according to nature because nature is not the indifferent entity that Stoics turned it into. The Stoics, and that's a mindfuck in a sense, wanted to be stable. They wanted to not be swayed. So what did they do? They projected that onto nature and they pretended that's what nature was. But then, as a reverberation effect, they copied nature. So they tried to live after nature, but they are the ones who create the nature that they live after. So it's a self-inflicted prophecy of sorts where you could just remove nature and just say, live like this. But it's not as potent when you do that because nature, in a sense, carries a certain degree of authority with it. So when you say, okay, obey nature, live according to nature, it's stronger than live according to this schmuck who used to write books about Stoicism. It's the reason why it was done in this fashion. But in truth, nature is just as subjective as us, and it has its own morality, a morality that we might not be able to understand, or rather that we understand too well because we were created by nature, an actual nature, meaning that I'm talking about the source here. This also should reconciliate you with the idea that I'm not opposed to the concept of the creator, and actually Nietzsche isn't either. What he's opposed to is this weird malformation that we have imposed on these concepts. At no point is he saying that we are not created by God or nature. Rather, he's saying that if we are, we do not understand these things. They are not like us, or maybe they are exactly like us, but either way, the way we have always described them has been wrong all around because of the malpractice that I just described. And that is because, of course, people always prefer the truth, but what they prefer is their version of the truth, which they created artificially. And that leads to them preferring a handful of certainties to a whole cartload of beautiful possibilities because it's more comfortable. So we have created a concept that we call the truth, and we follow it, not because it's the truth, not because it's actually life-furthering, but because it's what we've always done, or it's what everyone does, so we just do it, we follow suit. That is in direct opposition with the way Nietzsche wants to do things. He wants to constantly question it. Why are we doing things? Is it working? Is it beneficial? And if the answer is no, why do we continue to do it? Most people never ask these questions because they're uncomfortable questions, just like I did. When I question the nature of the creator, that is deeply uncomfortable for many people, but it should be part of philosophy because it's what philosophy is. It's the questioning of the wood. And keep in mind that this comfort, this idea that it's better to stick with certainties and to never actually delve into doubt is what gave birth to nihilism, the belief in a sure nothing. Now you have a bunch of people who believe in something and what they believe is nothing. So atheists, for example, also fall into that category. Atheism is not a faith, atheism is not a system of belief. It's nothing. Because you cannot base an entire ideology around the idea of not believing in anything. It makes no sense. Again, it's absurd. But that is in direct line with this constant pursuit of the truth. See how quickly it devolves. We pursue the truth so much that now we are left with an empty husk of what we call the truth. It does nothing for us, but we still stick to it because at least it's a sure something, even though technically it is nothing. It's always better to prefer what Nietzsche calls an uncertain something, something with substance that is tough to grasp, rather than, again, a sure nothing, which is nihilism. And the problem with this development of the empty truth is that it also gave birth to the triumph of philosophical pedantry over intellectual bravery. Philosophy has been going in circles because people have refused to actually expand. We refuse to challenge, which is incredibly cowardly. We need to keep expanding. In terms of other types of philosophies that have developed in the same line, we can describe skepticism. Skepticism, which is accepted by Nietzsche as something valuable in a certain degree, because the acceptation of nuances is the sign of a livelier soul. The black and white approach of the world, of good and evil, truth and untruth, is a death court in a sense, because it goes nowhere. That is the problem with that method of thinking. But, because there are, of course, issues and downsides to everything, skepticism can also go wrong, because it also leads to a scrutiny of one's own senses, perspective seen as damaging to an objective truth, what it is in reality the only way to access it. So, as you can see, there is balance in everything, and Nietzsche's philosophy is full of balance. If anything, it's always funny to see people describing him as an extremist when he was a perfect example of someone who was constantly looking both ways. He was taking things from both sides. And with skepticism, the acceptation of nuances is a good thing, but you must make sure it doesn't go too far. Because if you start to scrutinize your own senses and your own subjectivity, because again, your senses gave birth to your subjectivity, well, you're missing the point, because now you're starting to regard your ability to actually interact with the environment and perceive it as the enemy, because it is seen as damaging to an objective truth that doesn't exist. I've already described that. When in reality, it's the only way to access it. So, by rejecting subjectivity, rejecting opinions, and only looking for the truth, people lose the ability to access the truth. It keeps proving itself. The The hypothesis has been confirmed several times now with a different angle each time, which tends to mean in philosophy that it's actually as correct as could be. The body itself is distrusted in the skeptic mode of thinking, which is something we're going to go back to because it's the opposite of sensualism. This marks an attempt to regain an unquestionable truth that can only exist in faith, but which doesn't exist in modern ideas. So this points out at something interesting. There is a group of men, a group of people, of philosophers, who are going in the right direction, meaning that their heart is in the right place. And the reason why the heart is in the right place is because they understand that the concept of unquestionable truth must be out there. And that's, again, a show that Nietzsche never says that the truth doesn't exist. He just says that we cannot grasp it and we don't understand what it is yet. But the issue with that unquestionable truth is, again, that it's inaccessible to us, so it can only really exist in faith, which is also the reason why I believe that people who believe in God and who believe in religion have a point. They are perceiving the same thing. They are perceiving that there are some level of truths that are not accessible to humans and can only be found in blindly following something else. But if that something else is a creation of humans, there is where the problem lays. And modern ideas, of course, have gotten rid of that. It's the reason why Nietzsche says God is dead. It's not because God is dead, it's because we killed him. We removed the possibility of this unquestionable truth, while at the same time still pretending it exists. But now we have the hubris to pretend that it comes from us. At least religious people have the decency to accept that it comes from something greater than them, and therefore they cannot understand it fully. But the issue with these people and the religious people and the people who want to put all of their eggs in that one basket is that they tend to attempt to go backwards. So they try to go back to a time where God was alive. They tend to try to go back to a time where religion was more thriving than it is now. But it doesn't lead to anything because, as I said, people back then already had a skewed version of the truth and therefore couldn't access it. The idea and the perception of that unquestionable truth is great, but to be able to access it, we need to move forward. We need to continuously push philosophy forward. And to do that, we need to think about subjectivity and morality in different terms. We cannot think about them in terms of good and evil. We have to ask ourselves, why is belief in such judgments necessary in the first place? Again, we go back to a pragmatic approach to things, not tainted by romanticism or by emotions, which is very stoic if you think about it, but understand that the rejection of emotions by the Stoics also participates in the rejection of subjectivity, because emotions are expression of subjectivity. So I'm not saying that Nietzsche actually believes that. And by doing that, by doing what I just described, by questioning the importance of such beliefs, we are going to understand why they are necessary for the preservation of the species. And this is important. This is important because we must believe that they must be true. Again, we must believe that there is such thing as the truth, or else everything that we do, all of that pursuit, is for nothing. But we have to accept that they might still be false, that the ability that we have to reach the truth might be a dud, it might lead to nothing. It doesn't mean that the pursuit stops, it just means that we're not going to come up with gold every single time. Most of what we're going to unveil is not the truth, and that is perfectly acceptable. That is what I coined, and maybe someone else already used that term, utilitarian philosophy. An approach to philosophy that is centered around what is useful to humans and focuses on that entirely. An example of this is the idea of the soul. We can't accept that the soul exists outright because it would mean accepting an unquestionable truth. But we also cannot go the naturalist way and deem it a myth because it has too much value in and of itself. So it means that it deserves further examination. Does the soul exist? Yes, most likely. In terms of ideals, we want the soul to exist because it's an important concept that has value. Now we are in a healthy and safe point to start discussing a very unsafe topic, which is the topic of the soul. What is it? Why is it important? Can we lose it? Is it important for redemption? Does redemption even exist? All of these questions need to be asked, because if not, we're just left with what I call an empty idea. The soul exists. Okay, cool. What does it do for us? We don't know, we just know it exists. That is worthless. In terms of philosophy, it is anti-intellectual. Now, since all of these concepts that I described, so the soul, morality, the truth, subjectivity, etc., actually stem from our communal psyche, the best way to decorticate them is psychology. Because it allows us to strip morality of its mystique and to reveal it for what it is. A series of genealogical tenets. All of these things were created by humans, for humans, throughout the ages. Once we accept that, we can start looking at the reason why people came up with them, which gives, one, the ability to actually grasp the source, and then ask yourselves why. Why did we come up with all of these concepts and principles of morality? This is the objective. And you'll see that I'm going to go back on it later on, but that is where psychology and philosophy work hand in hand, because the two are necessary if we are to actually access the truth. But this will only happen if psychology stops running aground on moral prejudices and timidities, which is something that we felt that it's already too late. Nietzsche perceived what was going to happen, which is the deterioration of psychology into a soft science, when it was supposed to be the queen of science. It has lost its way because it's too timid, and it has refused to do what I described. It has refused to approach things from an utilitarian perspective. It spends too much time thinking about things that don't actually matter, and therefore it cannot get to the heart of things. The only way to fix psychology is to accept the will to power as the cardinal instinct of an organic being, so humans, and not self-preservation. Too much of psychology thinks that all that we do, all of our psychological traits stem from a desire to survive. That is not true. The desire to survive is only a branch of the will to power, the will to actually expand your power, express your power. And if you cannot understand that, then you are stuck. Because if the will to power is there and gives you access to this range of truth, well, if you only look at a branch of it, self-preservation, now you're stuck with this. Do you understand what this means? It means that psychology is 10% of what it could have been. We could have so much more, but this means going back and actually attempting to observe the human psyche the correct way. If you have 10 doors in front of you and you keep only trying to open one door because you have the key upside down, chances are you won't even be able to open one door. It doesn't mean that the other doors don't exist. It doesn't mean that there's nothing beyond the other doors. It just means that we are not able to approach it properly. This is a parallel with the truth. It's in a sense that the truth might be beyond the door, but we cannot open it. So we need to be more careful with our approach to that type of experimentation, of analysis. So by doing that and by accepting the will to power, we are going to reject the doctrine of the derivation of all good impulses from bad ones, which is what I described before, the hierarchical segregation in a sense of concepts between good and evil, and the hierarchy we created has of course found its place in psychology. All good impulses are seen as derivating from bad ones. And this is the problem, because even though you put the bad ones here and the good ones here, and you create a trickle-down effect between the two, yes, you've reversed what it used to be. You reversed the virtue that gave birth to unvirtue, the truth that gave birth to untruth. But at the end of the day, you are still creating a hierarchy, and it still doesn't function, because it is creating a factious approach to these concepts. So that is a rejection that needs to happen at all cost, because it's going to allow us to make feelings like hatred, for example, necessary for the general economy of life. They will not just be regarded as something that is a cause and it has created an effect because it reduces them. It reduces their existence as nothing but an impulse. Hatred is not just an impulse, it's both the impulse and the reaction. It's a valid emotion that needs to be observed as such. It also means moving our understanding of philosophy from a word explanation to a word arrangement. Too much of philosophy is seen through that lens of people who think, I'm going to read that book and it's going to explain everything I need to see and understand. That might be correct, but understand that if it happens, you are being duped. You are being lied to. There is someone that is pretending to sell you the truth, but in reality they sell you their truth, which is not your truth, so it's a lie. A good philosopher presents the word and arranges it in a way that makes sense, and then tells you, hey, what do you see here? We go back to psychology, look at Rorschach, which is incredibly disgusting to pronounce as a French speaker, test. What there should be is an open canvas for interpretation for the person who is looking at them. What they often become is the psychologist trying to project their own subjectivity onto you, or they say, what do you see? Do you see a butterfly? Yeah, that doesn't work now because now the test is completely useless. So that's what Nietzsche means by the difference between word explanation and word arrangement. We always need to strive for word arrangement because it's when subjectivity can be utilized to its full potential and not just shoved into people's faces. So if psychology is to explain why humans do things, then philosophy will take care of the how. It's what I presented before. The two work hand in hand. If we go back to the way we need to approach philosophy, we need to think about them in terms of preservation of the species. Why do we do things? And that is something that is only really accessible through psychology. Psychology can observe things as morality again and say, okay, we decided that incest is bad. That's a moral tenet that wasn't ascribed in nature. Why do we do that? Why have we decided as an intelligent species that incest is bad? The answer is very simple. It creates faulty offsprings. It destroys bloodlines. There, we just explain morality. This can be done for every single moral tenet, which also means that for the people who think Nietzsche actually hated morals, wrong. He wanted to question morality because he understands that if we sift through morality, we're going to get rid of all the bullshit and keep all of the important things because we will know why it's there in the first place. Psychology can do that with effectiveness if it fixes itself. And then philosophy comes in as the 1-2 punch combo and takes care of the how. Why is interesting, but how do we do it? How do we create morality and how do we keep it going? This is something that we need to concern ourselves with, something that Nietzsche was trying to do with his books by giving us a guide of sorts. Just like subjectivity and morality, modes of perception need to be observed for what they're worth. It's what I just described. Everything goes back to core values. An example of two modes of thoughts that give a certain degree of understanding when it comes to trying to grasp those things and explain the how, okay, not the why. The why is for psychology, but the how we do things, how we think as humans, is the sensualist versus the Platonist mode of thought. So the sensualist, the sensualism, only accepts what can be seen and felt. So they base everything off of the senses. And the Platonists resist self-evidence and they resist the senses in the sense that they perceive them as being faulty, as being potentially falsehood. And they replace those senses with conceptual networks. Now, Nietzsche himself described sensualism as a more plebeian approach to philosophy because it's what the mass and the common people like to do. I see something, it's there, my eyes told me that it's there, so it's there. It's as simple as that. A more aristocratic mode of thinking is the Platonist one, where you replace the senses by concepts that are not as easily swayed by our subjectivity and perception. But keep in mind, again, that at no point will sensualism be removed entirely because sensualism is subjectivity. So if you understand where he's coming from here, he's telling you that the two need to come hand in hand. You need to accept the importance of the senses, and then you need to create a dam and a bridge that is going to filter the senses and only keep the important part. Again, it's exactly the same method he's prescribing about morality, subjectivity, and the truth. Everything needs to be observed, but how do we do it? He just told us. Now, as I said, sensualism has its place, but cannot be accepted as immediate certitudes. And he uses an example that I find particularly funny when he compares the external world and organs. So he uses the example of sensualists who say that we perceive the external world via our organs, but that quickly leads to the realization that since our organs are part of the external world, then by default this means that we perceive the external world through the external world, which is a reduction ad absurdum. This is the issue with sensualism. Relying only on the senses only gets you so far. It's the reason why it's a plebeian mode of thinking. It stops at some point. There is a glass ceiling of semantics, of rhetoric that just cannot be breached with only that mode. This is when the concepts of Platonist thought mode come into play. They allow you to actually go forward and forth. But if you refuse or if you turn your back on sensualism, let's say that sensualism is the projector underneath the rocket, it's the rocket launcher, it sends you into space. Halfway through, the Platonic mode of thought takes over and it gets rid of the rocket launcher, but you're not there yet. You're not at a point where you can actually get rid of it, and most likely you never will. Why? Truth and untruth. The two concepts go hand in hand. You cannot separate the two. If you do, you lose the point and you are not able to actually think anymore. So the senses are important, but they need to be distrusted, and that distrust must never lead to the actual refusal to use the senses. I hope that this makes sense to you. And the problem is that if you don't actually do that, if you don't abide by that principle, you're going to end up with a ton of contradictions, because you're going to end up with, a Platonist mode of thought that is going to infer knowledge and understanding from what? Right? Everything comes from the senses. Your mode of thought and the concept and the networks you created are based on the senses. So now you remove the senses and the network doesn't work anymore. It has nothing to work with. It's like trying to put diodes and electrodes on the brain, but now you remove the brain. Okay, cool. What are you observing now? Nothing. So this is the logic behind it. And another example of that is the infamous I think, therefore I am, which Nietzsche describes as the thing in itself. Once you enter that type of mode of thought, you are lost because it goes in circle. I think, therefore I am, therefore I think. Okay, but what does that do for us? Yes, it gives an explanation as to the how, but it also in a sense gives a false explanation of the why. I think, therefore I am. Why? Well, there is no answer to that question, so it's not a mode of thought that actually leads anywhere. Let me see if we still have time. No, we are out of time. So I'm going to end up on this note for today, and we are going to reconvene in 2 weeks with the follow-up episodes. I hope that this made more sense. It was just as dense, even more dense, but I am confident that this is the proper way to approach that type of complex literature, and I am looking forward to see what you guys thought about it. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.